Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Wired for Logic podcast. I have my guest today, Wolf Lichtenstein. Did I say that
That's
correctly?
perfect.
Okay, awesome. He's the principal over at Evergreen Carbon and their carbon offset company. I'll let you kind of go into a little more detail about what you guys do, how you help clients, and what brought you into the business to begin with.
Yeah, sure. Well, start last question. I always felt that I wanted to do environmental work. It seems to be kind of a deep purpose in my life. And I was an environmental chemist, environmental scientist for many years, and I went back to grad school and studied sustainability that included, issues around climate and organizational change and such. And I thought climate change. I kind of went to a lecture on the California cap and trade when it was first starting up in the late '90s, and I thought, you know what, this is a good thing, and I think I can, work here in this industry and be doing a good thing, help the communities. Through that, I was doing work for different organizations, doing some auditing work and et cetera, and learning more about climate change, greenhouse gas accounting and such as part of my job functions. And I ended up in Peru in the North Andes, witnessing a carbon project, a project that had speciated a particular type of pine that grows up at these higher elevations, and they're working on a afforestation project to plant trees and give these farmers who are really marginal farmers a kind of another source of income. And while they're sequestering carbon through this, they're using eucalyptus at lower elevations and then this pine species at the highest elevations here in the North Andes. And I saw the confluence of community, of NGOs, individual farmers engaged. I had like personal stories that I'm observing and witnessing. A farmer with his young daughter, I learned he's away from home 3 weeks out of every 4 to work someone else's land. And that explained his 4-year-old little girl just clinging to him and not letting go while we were going through this interview with this gentleman farmer. And he explained that, yeah, I'm away from home a lot, so my girl wants to be with me when I'm here. And having a carbon project would allow that man to stay on his land, right? Because he has another source of income while growing trees that wouldn't have been there, and working on climate change, a kind of big global climate change, and a very local story between a man and this young daughter. So that drew me in. And so I started up Evergreen Carbon. That was around 2014. Came up with the name because I live in the Evergreen state, and it just felt natural. And so the way Evergreen Carbon works is we are carbon market experts, again, kind of based a lot on my own knowledge and my own experience, deep knowledge in carbon markets. And so we work across the spot market to find appropriate carbon projects for businesses if they're looking to offset their carbon footprint. I also, help, of course, with that footprinting and any other kind of sustainability and greenhouse gas issues. I do work on feasibility and startups. So someone who says, "Oh, I think I can get carbon credits for what I'm doing," and I'll work with them till I kind of prove that they can't, or demonstrate that, yeah, I think this is a go and I think we should move ahead, type of thing. So kind of start on the feasibility studies and what they'll need to develop a carbon project is not an easy task. And so, yeah, I can help on that end as well.
So, what kind of clients do you typically have? Are they small to medium sized businesses? Are they enterprise? Like, what's your typical client?
Well, my typical clients are the small and medium-sized businesses, local businesses with a sustainability ethic, that type of thing, or other businesses that do have kind of a wider demand to do something sustainable because the owners or the shareholders are wanting something like that. So some large businesses, but mostly kind of medium-sized businesses who are already on that sustainability path. Right.
Okay.
If they don't believe that climate change is a thing, and they don't believe what's in front of their eyes and their ears, then, that's not my job to convince them about the reality of where we're living and what we're doing. But if they're already on this path, I'm like, yeah, let me smooth that path. Let me make it easy. So I ease the transactions. And again, working across the spot market, I can look at, projects really across the planet that kind of meet meet, my client where they are. So I can give a quick example is I like a sustainability oriented grocery store chain called PCC, the Puget Consumer Co-op. And they have about 14, 15, maybe even more grocery stores around the Puget Sound, the Seattle, and wider areas. And all the food is great. It's sustainably grown. They focus on local when they can get it, and it's just a wonderful place to do your grocery shopping. And I've been working with them for several years. Last purchase, they purchased credits from a cookstove project in Ghana, and the cookstoves basically are distributed free of charge, and they're efficient. And so really 3 billion people on the planet still cook their meals with direct biomass, with wood and coal, charcoal, that type of thing. And having these efficient cook stoves, they use less of this biomass, and they also manages smoke and particulate matter. So a lot of kids are cooking with their moms, because the mom takes care of the kids all day, so they're in there cooking, and the particulate matter bothers eyes, throats, and really repeated time in that environment, a smoke-laden environment, can cause all kinds of problems, right? So an efficient cook stove will lower that particulate matter. It burns efficiently. They use a lot less biomass, thus preserving the local forests. And so you can actually measure the amount of biomass that was used before the introduction of the cook stoves and then after. I was actually in PCC doing my own grocery shopping, and I picked up some chocolate, and I noticed, oh, it's from Ghana, and it had the PCC label on it. So it was branded, by PCC, their own grocery store. So it was their own brand of house chocolate. I mean, it's a wonderful grocery store. I mean, there's many of them. There's one in my neighborhood, so that's the one I frequent. But I've been on the PCC for a while, so I noticed the chocolate from Ghana after after consulting with the client. We decided on this cook stove project as something that Mike, who heads up their sustainability group, was familiar with from other work that he's done, and so we decided on that. And what I explained, Wes, was that in a cook stove project, you're using less wood. So the stoves are distributed for free. You're using less wood. It burns more efficiently and hotter. So you don't have the particulate matter that many children and women suffer with who cook on these open, 3-stone fires. Again, 3 billion people on the planet, are still cooking on an open fire, like all their meals. And boiling
Okay.
water just to make it potable, on a big old fire. And that decimates local forests. The women and children basically spend their days gathering firewood and cooking meals. The next day they wake up and do the same thing. When you use an efficient cook stove, you gather, 2/3 less firewood is needed to cook the same number of meals. And so you're preserving the forest. You're able to use different types of biomass. You don't have to turn it into charcoal first or something like that. Cut down big trees, which there is a charcoal trade out there in many kind of villages that are not in the first modern world. We're not talking New York City. We're talking about a village far away from services. And for years, this is how they've cooked their meals and forage for food and hunt and whatever and grow their crops and such. So cook stoves and other technologies like solar, things like that, brings kind of some modern technology to these villages and allow more time for kids to study, to go to school. There's a lot of these projects from the carbon finance. This is the money that a company will pay. That carbon finance money pays back the developer for creating the project, which again, as I mentioned, they're not easy to do. There's a lot of check boxes to make sure you're doing it right. More than that, there's very serious work, and the quality has to be there, and the competencies of all the people engaged in projects have to be present. But what turns out is that these technologies bring, and the carbon finance bring, more success to the village. They can maybe send, a young person to school overseas to learn to be a doctor, and then come back and service the community. Carbon finance will provide for doctors or nurses and clinics and schools and clean fresh water, well water, preserve the biodiversity of the area. As populations grow, if everyone's trying to cook their meals from trees in their local forests, the local forest won't exist right after a time. So, and there's projects that restore forests. We will restore like mangrove forests that were once there, but they're all kind of cut down and used for cooking meals, that wood and stuff. So replanting mangroves and really understanding the hydrology of the area, which can be locked up in the indigenous community, the elders of the community. Well, it used to be this way, and you can understand the hydrology from that historical accounts, among with other, of course, pure science studies, and understand the best ways and best areas in order to reconstruct a mangrove forest. And you can get credits for that because the mangroves, again, as they grow, they're sequestering carbon that can be measured very accurately, actually. And the mangroves themselves will protect from storms and provide nutrients and hiding space for young fish, so it improves their fisheries and things. So lots of times, you see, oh, I can cut down this tree and cook my meals. If the whole village or everyone in the area has that same conclusion, the forest will be gone very quickly. Being more sustainable, having cook stoves, having access to other technology and other education and awareness helps people thrive in a really changing and challenging climate.
Do you besides these, you're saying cook stones, right? Like a I guess a
Stove,
piece of
cook
stone,
stove, a cook stove.
cook stove, okay.
A stove. So an efficient stove, basically, you're able, and it's vented properly. It uses a lot less biomass. You feed in some sticks and twigs as opposed to big logs, right? And
Got
you're
it.
able to get your fire hot enough and sustain it long enough using a lot less biomass in order to cook your meals with less smoke, less particulate matter, and less degradation of the local forests.
So besides those, are there other things? You mentioned solar briefly. I don't know if you guys help fund projects that provide solar power to these villages and stuff like that, because I have heard of those, but I don't know if that's something you guys do as well.
Yeah, so carbon projects come in many, many forms, including renewable energy. Now, there's been some constrictions of late because what we find is that as more people use solar, that the cost of solar has come way down. So solar projects are still incredibly valued, and I would go to the mat for any solar or wind project because they're great, but I wouldn't necessarily give carbon credits for it. Those carbon credits are kind of compared to, well, before the solar project, they were using, energy from a coal-fired plant. And so you're replacing that fossil fuel on the grid, and that's how you calculate the carbon credits. But what we find is a lot of these renewable energy projects are addition to the existing fossil fuel infrastructure. So when it's time to put more energy on the grid, of course, with these, we're going to talk about AI, things like that, these amazing server farms, things like that, their energy sucks, right? And so um, you're going to be adding power anyway. And so you're going to add solar power. And the costs of solar, costs of wind are very competitive and actually cheaper than doing, saying, a natural gas fired turbine, right? And because also you got to look at every month you have a natural gas bill, right? If you're running a turbine, right? So if you're running solar, hey, you're pretty good. And you combine solar with batteries, you're doing great. So this is where the technologies are going. But back to our village, say in Africa, someplace, they don't have access to that. So in least developed countries that are identified by the UN stuff, solar projects can still take hold and still gather carbon credits because they are actually replacing, say, a diesel generator. And diesel
Okay.
fuel, for a small village is expensive. It's, we know what petroleum, how much you pay to fill up gas in your car. It affects all fossil fuels. And so, you want it. And what's amazing in my travels is I've been to these developing countries and places that are pretty far away from civilization, and everyone has a cell phone. Everyone uses cell phones to communicate, to whatever, find out where they are, what they're doing, to communicate with their family and friends, and to manage various different aspects of what they're doing. I was in a soil carbon project in Kenya, and it was just wonderful to see. And it looked very primitive. The people who are shepherding the animals, who have to live and cohabitate with the wildlife, both situations have to be addressed in this carbon project. Yeah, everyone's walking around with cell phones, right? And they get to a place where they can charge it up for the day or whatever. So if there's a solar array in the village, it's great. And if there's, ways for kids to study at night, that type of things. A generator running on diesel is noisy. It creates the pollution, adds CO2 to the atmosphere. To replace that with a renewable energy is really a good thing. So you can get carbon credits in those situations. So, but there's, forestry projects. We're working with there's biomass projects where people are taking biomass, instead of burning it, they're burying it or turning it into biochar, which has multiple uses. So this is basically taking the carbon, instead of letting it naturally decay through bacteria and put CO2, and in anaerobic conditions put methane back into the atmosphere, which is, a very potent greenhouse gas. You can manage that biomass and take that out of our carbon cycle. We're taking some biomass out of it. And then, so as the new forest grows, so as an example of like a big forest fire comes through, you have a lot of standing, like half-burnt wood, which can't be milled, can't be turned into anything, can't be turned into furniture or housing or 2x4s, because it's damaged by the fire, right? Even though it's still
Right.
standing, but it's kind of dead, right, at that point. So you can take that wood, instead of letting it stand there, or cut it down and build a big pile and torch it and get rid of it, right? You want to bury that biomass or put it through a kiln and create biochar. And then those kilns are really, we can unpack that for a while. So I won't go there right now unless you ask. But basically, we're taking biomass and we're taking out of the carbon cycle, burying it,
Okay.
sequestering it away. Right. So that's a form of carbon capture, and it's permanent, right? Where forestry or agricultural project has a potential of being reversed, in part because of a forest fire or something like that. So there's buffer systems built into these registries. And so if one project goes south, a nature-based project goes south, buffer credits will be retired to replace ones that have been purchased. So, but the industry is moving towards more permanent. So these kind of biomass burning and biochar, are very popular and actually very expensive credits to purchase right now.
You mentioned solar and battery, and I can tell you from personal experience, I had solar panels put on the house, and I liked the offset of power usage during the day. That was nice. I didn't see as much benefit as I thought there would be when I initially got them. And come to find out, I talked with my solar people like a year or two later, and they said, "Oh, we can get you some Tesla Powerwalls, and then those will, capture any additional, instead of selling it back to the grid during the day, because we're not home, right? So it's not running the AC as much. It's not using as much power. So we're producing all this power during the day, but we're not using all of it. So we're selling it back to the grid at pennies on the dollar. Why not capture that and use that into the evening hours when there's not sun and solar power being generated?" And once we got those, and the energy offset is sufficient, significant. I mean, not sufficient, significant versus what we were getting before.
Right, right. Yeah. So just that technology in general, having a battery with, say, if you're in Nevada or a place like that, you can see or California, you can see these very large solar arrays, and if they're backed up by batteries, that type of thing. And there's other technologies. So what do we do at nighttime, or what do we do when the wind stops? So you combine a battery or energy storage. There's been hydro storage, where during the day you're pumping water up into a reservoir, at night you're releasing the water through a turbine, that type of thing, in order to get power 24/7. Like I said, these are great solutions here for the first world, right? So if you can afford it, you can go out and get yourself a power wall. And Tesla isn't the only one out there building these things, but they're certainly a very good product, right? And you can go and get one of these things. And then, yeah, I have an electric car, and I plug it in, at nighttime, and it's charged up in the morning when I'm ready to go. So it works great for me. I don't have solar in my home. That's kind of the next thing. But yeah, I would want to combine it with batteries. Gives us more independence. And if you're looking to do this for your own home, you got to check with your utility, because this is called net metering, where they give you money back, right, for the energy you
Right.
put back on the grid. Some utilities will do one for one, so which is great. If they charge you, 15 cents for a kilowatt, and they're going to pay you 15 cents for every kilowatt you put on their grid. Others, like you said, will give pennies on a dollar. And they also have, the utilities have to manage this distributed power. So that's kind of the new thing too. So some utilities might push back because there might be some infrastructure changes or some other costs that they have to absorb in order to have all these grid-tied solar units. But generally, if you can plan for it, do it, because it's a smart thing to
Yep.
do, and you can avoid building another peaking plant using methane, that type of thing, which is best right now. If you wanted to build a turbine power system, there's such a backlog on turbines, and get one, it's going to take you like a year, 5 years in order to build. Yeah, no kidding.
Wow.
So you could put up a solar array a lot more quickly, right? And so
Okay.
you can address those power gaps. And again, we're looking at different battery technologies are coming to the fore. So, we're going to see more and more of that. And really what we need is for the community to say this is what we want, and tell their utilities what they want, and kind of, be public, public comments, talk to your elected representatives so legislation can be passed to ease this transition. Right. We have a lot of legislation that favors fossil fuel, all the way down to subsidizing ExxonMobil. It's like, why would you subsidize a multi-billion-dollar, trillion-dollar company? It makes no sense, but when they're
Yep.
paying for the politicians, you
Yeah.
can get that. So the people really need to have a deeper understanding of sustainability and what you can do as an individual, as you have done, put solar panels on your home and figure out, what the next step is, add a power wall for yourself. But then what about the community at large? Community has to be as informed as well. And maybe we
Yes.
want to subsidize solar instead of subsidizing fossil fuels.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, think about the weight that it would take off the grid if you incentivized each and every home in a city to get just even getting solar, like forget the power walls, but you would multiply that exponentially if they also got power walls. And I'll tell you what, it's really nice when there's a storm and you see the lights flicker for a split second, and then you get the notification on your phone that says the grid is out and you're now running off your power wall, and it charged the batteries up to full capacity because it knew there was a storm coming in. It monitors the weather, and it'll automatically charge the batteries from the grid, keep them at 100%, wait till the storm passes, and then it draws off the batteries. So you're not wasting the power. The power's there to be used, whether you use it during the storm or after the storm.
Right. No, that's wonderful. I wasn't really aware, but that's brilliant because I have these great apps on my phone that shows like a weather system coming in. I know hour by hour how much rain and wind I'm going to be getting here. To connect that technology with battery storage and solar, oh my gosh, that's so efficient, right? That's amazing, and so if we could distribute systems like that widely, rapidly, we can avoid building new natural gas installations. And really, it's not only just burning the natural gas, it's the whole supply chain of natural gas.
Yes.
A wellhead up in Colorado, up in northern BC, from there, it has to be cleaned. You have to get rid of the H2S, hydrogen sulfide, right, which is a very dangerous gas. It smells like rotten eggs. If you're smelling it, it's almost like too late. You can die from it. So you have sour gas and sweet gas. So sour gas needs to be cleaned up before it gets on the pipeline. They're doing more with renewable natural gas as well, taking methane coming off a landfill or from dairy farms using a digester and containing that degradation of the biomass into methane in an anaerobic condition and cleaning that up, and it goes through. I've been to these places where you're removing nitrogen and removing all this stuff, and you get the pure methane at the end of the cycle, and then that methane is then put onto the pipeline, and then that
Interesting.
methane from the basically biomethane or methane from biological sources that are not fossil, right? Found in pockets under the ground, but something you're creating with a landfill, you can take that methane. It's the same as any other. Methane is methane, so it doesn't know what the sources is. But what you're doing is avoiding the fugitive emissions coming off that dairy farm or coming off that landfill. And methane, though it maybe sticks around for 15, 20 years, but it's like 25 times more potent than CO2. So in our immediate climate crisis, managing methane is a really important thing. So, yeah.
Tell me, that sounds really interesting. I know I've been traveling before and just smelt the stench of methane, cow manure or whatnot. It's like, man, that's really powerful. It'd be cool to find a way to get rid of that smell, to capture that. How does that work to capture that gas and then filter it and use it for something useful besides it stinking the place up?
Sure. So let's talk about what a digester project is. It's basically a livestock project. So animals have manure associated with them. That manure.
Associated.
Yeah, and so, basically, traditionally, the manure is put into a lagoon, basically a pond, and, a meter down, you're getting no oxygen to that manure, and so the bacteria that proliferates is anaerobic bacteria, basically bacteria that doesn't need oxygen, and that product of anaerobic bacteria is methane. That's a waste product from bacteria digestion and growth. It's devolving methane. So you get these little methane bubbles, and from this lagoon, those little bubbles they go into our atmosphere, and 1 ton of that is equivalent to 25 tons of CO2, and it stays in the atmosphere. Yeah, it's called a global warming potential. There are other gases that are even more potent than CO2, but we all kind of normalize our calculations to CO2, so CO2 equivalent, right? And so you're getting this methane. So instead of pushing your manure into a lagoon, because it can't pile up in the barn, right? So they have scrapers or someone with a shovel, depending on the size and the automation going on with that dairy
Yeah.
farm, you have a lot of manure. And so you build a digester, which is a container, usually like maybe a concrete bunker or something like that, and the manure gets scraped in there. And there might be a screw in the bottom that moves it along right through the chamber, and it's being digested, right? And because it's a place where you're not exposing it to oxygen, you are continuing to get that anaerobic bacteria that you had in the lagoon, but now you have it in a contained bunker, and then that's creating methane. So that gas then comes out, and so there's a pipe, right, and valves and whatever, machines, and you have a gas analyzer to find out what percentage of that gas is methane, because there's other hydrocarbons and other gases in there. And then you're able to measure the amount of methane by understanding the flow of the gas out of the digester. So you know how much methane is there, the flow of that methane, and then you know how much methane you have, and then you destroy it. I'd say the least worthwhile way of doing that is in a flare. So just having it go up a pipe, you light it on fire and you have this flare. If you're driving by some refinery or some other place, you might see a flare going off. It's just like a candle
Yep.
flame going up, at high, at 10 or 30 meters, right? Well, probably like 10 meters, like 30 up there, so 30 or 60 feet up there, and you're burning that methane. Or you can direct that methane into, say, a turbine, say a Caterpillar engine, and then that fires that engine, that methane, and because you're burning it, the product of combustion of methane is CO2. So from a global warming potential of 25, it's back down to 1 because you just burned it. And so you get CO2 and water coming out of the tailpipe, and then you're turning this turbine, creating electricity. So you take that electricity and you grid tie it. So those are renewable, that's kind of renewable electricity, or electrons really coming through that digester process. Other ways of dealing with that methane is to clean it up, compress it, and put it back on the utilities pipeline. And so you have a meter there and you have cleaned up methane and you're delivering it to a pipeline. And so your local gas company is adding this renewable natural gas to its mix of methane. When you turn on your gas stove at home, you're burning, a mix of fossil fuel methane and then also renewable methane. And so you can
Okay.
give credits for doing that. We have like regulations that are like low carbon fuel standards. We find them in California. We find them in Canada. We find it, and this is new legislation here in Washington State, where I live, to provide carbon credits and incentive. They're not different types. These are low carbon fuel credits type of thing, or basically looking at your natural gas is now less carbon intensive, right? Because you have this renewable methane in there. Yet from a climate crisis point of view, methane is methane, and it's all bad. So
Right.
burning natural gas is not the best thing to do, but it's certainly, if we're creating infrastructure like landfills, things like that, we are creating methane. And so, we need to find ways not to do that. And so a carbon project that deals with methane is, are important projects, but those are kind of avoidance credits. They are permanent, right? And so different carbon projects might have different values to it, right? So, but say a landfill, say a privately owned landfill that's accepting, waste from grocery stores and football stadiums and such, what was I going to say about this? That methane, just no one's responsible for it, right? They're not paying a tax to pollute that methane. And if they wanted to control the methane, you need to, typically landfill management caps a certain area. And then to capture the methane, wells are actually sunk into the vertical and horizontal wells are sunk into the landfill, and then blowers are attached, and so you're basically pulling air, or pulling the methane essentially out of that landfill, because it's an anaerobic, it's not exposed because it has dirt and a cover on top of it, or more garbage on top of that, right? So you're able to capture that methane. And again, with a gas analyzer and flow meters, you can see how much methane you have. And then you can destroy it the same way as in a livestock project, using a digester to deal with the manure. And so they're very related to waste management. And so it might cost a landfill $1 million in order to install the wells and the blowers and the equipment, and to develop the project and monitor and hire the personnel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of work that has to be done. Yeah. So
Right.
those carbon credits, pay back the investment, and certainly one of the tests that you'll see is as a legal test in a carbon project. So if it's legally required, you don't get carbon credits. So it has to be additional, beyond business as usual. So if
Okay.
you're in a medium or large size landfill, the government associates and mandates and say, hey, you can have only this amount of gas coming off of it. If you have too much, then you have to find ways to capture it and reduce that amount by law. So when your landfill becomes big enough, you're then subject to the legal requirements, and then you don't get money for destroying or managing that methane. But a smaller one who has no requirements on it and does this voluntarily, you do get carbon credits to help pay for it. And what's good for like a landfill is to get involved in this, because as you kind of expand the landfill, you are getting into a territory where you might be regulated. So if you do it during this voluntarily on the volunteer side, when it's
Right.
smaller, you're building the infrastructure. If you decide today to build a giant landfill, out of a hole in the ground, start collecting waste, at some point you're going to be regulated for stormwater runoff and for what they call non-methane organic compounds. That's what they measure. So if you're getting vinyl chloride or other things coming off your landfill, it gets too much. You know that methane is 50% of that gas coming off, and you're regulated, end of story. And so it's better to do this voluntarily. And so carbon credits help pay for that. And what I love are nature-based projects that have carbon finance that get invested back into the community, which we were talking about earlier. So, yeah.
Is there I've seen kind of like you were talking about with capturing the methane um at like some of the livestock areas. See, I don't know how efficient they are. Something that's interesting to me is those carbon capture devices, and I don't know if those are scalable to any kind of size that would make a difference with greenhouse gases. I've seen some of the units in some videos and stuff like that I've watched, but how do
Yeah.
those work? And are those can you make it big enough to where it actually make an impact on?
Right. That's a really, really good question. Right now, no, the technology is not there. It's not distributed widely enough. And it takes a lot of energy. Imagine, having, well, we're close to 400 plus parts per million, or more than 400, like 425, 428 parts per million of CO2 to the rest of the air. So even though it has this very pronounced greenhouse gas effect warming the planet, but trying to pull that CO2 out of the air mixture that's mostly nitrogen and then oxygen and then a little bit of CO2 is a technical challenge, and it requires a lot of energy inputs. And so if your energy is coming from your grid and your grid is powered by fossil fuel and you're using that energy to capture a little bit of CO2, you'll never catch up with the fossil fuel that it took to power the array. There's hope, but I think there's hype with direct air capture, because I think it's being done, and there are companies are doing this, and they're maybe selling their carbon credits for doing that privately and not through the traditional registered, peer-reviewed, quality controlled, validated and verified by independent third parties. That's typically how carbon projects come online. But you as a private company can put up a website and say, hey, give me $3,000 and I'll name this captured CO2 after you, type of thing. So I think, some people will be mad at me for kind of poo-pooing this. Again, it's just, if you look at the energy balance, and it's just like, just stop, right? It's like if you're doing that and you're subsidizing fossil fuel industry at the same time, it seems ridiculous. And why would I buy those carbon credits when I can have a better effect by buying an EV, or encouraging my neighbor to buy one, or putting solar on my roof to avoid using that fossil fuel? Here in Seattle, our energy is very clean because it's mostly hydro, and they have a lot of renewable wind and solar on the grid, and really only a small portion peaking plants are from burning methane and the like. We're shutting down coal plants, so we're not really using, I think beyond this year, we won't be using coal or any coal on our grid in the Seattle area.
That's great.
So, other municipalities, other areas of the country do not have the luxury of having all this hydropower. So, renewable things are, really important. So we have to look at how things can scale in certain areas. The carbon capture technology that you're referring to, also once you capture that CO2, you got to put it someplace, right?
Yeah, how
So
does that work?
So you off gas it, you capture it, you compress it, and you either there's direct carbon storage, like say in some salt formation way deep underground, and you can store it and cap it there. Put some monitors, at ground level to see if there is any methane leaking. You can measure that in be it satellite or direct sensor very close to the source. So every area, it needs to look at customizing and creating grids, creating power. There's a lot of work to be done, and we're really in a crisis area where we saw this hurricane came through last week on uh Jamaica, and this country, this island nation, is devastated. And right now, people are really suffering, from water and having power and being safe. And they're outdoors because their homes are destroyed. It takes a lot of money to bring that island back. And so, I don't think the country's coffers can really pay for that. And it's not their fault. They weren't creating the pollution that generated this huge storm. They're talking about, category 5. They're thinking, oh, I think we're going to have to add a category 6 because we're getting bigger storms that are beyond what we would consider category 5. So it's like, wow,
That should be
who's
alarming
gonna,
to everyone.
excuse me?
That should be alarming to everyone.
It should be. It should be. And I'm on these forums with some of the most amazing climate scientists on planet Earth, and they're, talking about different things like albedo. I wrote some blog posts about albedo recently, which is like the loss of sea ice and snow at these higher latitudes in the Arctic. The Arctic has been warming four times faster than the rest of the planet. And what happens is when you lose sea ice, you lose that reflective capacity of the sun hitting the earth. And so it gets absorbed by the dark ocean. So you're heating things up even faster. You're not reflecting back the light with ice and
Yep.
snow cover. And to me, that's incredibly alarming. Lowering albedo, like even 1%, is a catastrophe on planet Earth. And so we're not talking about, the climate scientists are talking about that, the emergency in the Arctic and things like that, that's being talked about. But you turn on your news, you don't hear even one word about climate change. You talk about the devastation, in these island nations with a hurricane coming through. Climate change is, maybe that's because of climate change. And then that's it. That's the end of the story. Nothing is unpacked. Nothing is saying, well, we should start doing this as a civilization. We need to start organizing ourselves. We need to understand there's a lot of regulatory framework, international agreements and stuff, how to manage our oceans. So it's like some of that is like kind of set up with the precautionary principle, which is something I learned in graduate school, which we really should have corporations do that. So you don't like put a chemical out there without doing thorough testing. In the
Right.
United States, they put it out there, and then if there's blowback, they deal with it, right? In Europe, it's like, this is not approved stuff to put on your land as a pesticide or herbicide. You can't do that. Or there's a difference between organic or more sustainable farming or chemically injecting your soil with chemical phosphorus and other nutrients that are made, that are through an industrial process, a looting industrial process to get that nutrient to your soil. Harking back to a digester, one digester I was at, they're working with, I think it was Washington State University, but they're looking at taking what was left, the supernate from the digestion process, and then the solids, and being able to pull out like phosphorus and nitrogen from the waste of the waste. After
Wow.
capturing the methane, you have the solid mass, and they're looking at ways to get more organic fertilizer back onto the land, which is a lot smarter than some chemical process at some centralized plant with trucks moving in and out. And yeah. I was at a fertilizer plant, like one plant. I also learned that a factory and a plant are different things. A factory might have four plants doing the same thing. A plant is like a process, right? So
Right.
I was at a fertilizer manufacturing site, and they had four plants going. One of the reactors had a secondary catalyst in it that was destroying nitrous oxide, right? So we talked about how methane is 25 times more potent. Nitrous oxide is like 265 times more potent than CO2.
Wow.
So controlling nitrous oxide, which is laughing gas you get at the dentist's office, is a highly polluting gas. And so if you can use less chemical fertilizer or put in the best available technology. But right now, there are no laws. There's no regulatory framework to say you're a fertilizer plant, you have to use secondary and tertiary catalysts to manage your nitrous oxide, and this is your limit of of oxide. Right now, there's much of it in the atmosphere as you want. Who cares? We all will care, right? The people in Jamaica care. So we have to really come together and raise our consciousness and kind of work together on solutions that are national and continental type of solutions. And then when we look at the oceans, truly global efforts. There are techniques that are being researched and authenticated of doing an ocean going version of removing carbon from. So if you can move carbon, because we have excess carbon in the oceans, some areas become more acidic, which makes it
Hmm.
difficult for coral and shellfish to grow. And so you can basically and they might be missing a key nutrient in that particular area. So phytoplankton can't grow, algae can't grow.
Right.
And so you fertilize an area of the ocean with, say, iron and other nutrients that they might possibly need, and you get this algae bloom, and then the algae bloom sinks. It provides food, and then it sinks down and like sequestering that carbon for a really long time. And then you have the ocean air interface, and so now that area ocean has less CO2 in it, less carbonic acid at that point, right? And so it can absorb more from the atmosphere. So you're removing it instead of directly from the atmosphere, is what you're asking about earlier, how it's kind of
Right.
difficult. If we can take advantage of natural processes and natural algae and phytoplankton growth, right? Diatom growth, that type of thing. So food for salmon and other fish, if we can take use of natural systems and maybe enhance them for human purposes, right? And so
That
there's
makes
there's
sense.
ways to work with our environment that doesn't damage it.
Yep.
So that's kind of the consciousness change, to say we are not above nature controlling it. We are actually part of nature. Our human activity is natural, or it's building some big old oil refinery. Well, that's human beings doing that. Human beings come from the earth. All our molecules are from the planet earth in our bodies. We're part of this. How do we like raise our consciousness and say, we need to look at the whole system and figure out what levers in the whole system to pull in order to make the planet livable for all of us together, And if you have groups of people who are just after the money, doing whatever it takes to make more and more money, and you have shareholders trying to make more and more money, that consciousness, that responsibility to the whole kind of gets overpowered by the noise of everything else. And
Gets
really,
lost in the
it's
mix.
that quiet raise of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. We have permafrost that's melting, creating even more methane, on land in permafrost, but also under the water, under ocean and lakes. We
Right.
have methane frozen. And if things warm up enough, we get these huge blooms of methane bubbles coming up. We see this in Siberia now, where all of a sudden a big hole will kind of explode and it's just methane coming out, right? Because, there's a pocket underneath the ground that's now melting, and it's through bacteria and everything else, and methane is now being freed. And then, it'll gather and somehow pressure builds up and you see these
Yep.
holes. And
Like a
someone's like,
beach ball underwater.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I'm sort of at the point I've been doing this for a while, sort of like, it's like how, it's like shouting into the wilderness. And certainly when I go to conferences or have conversations with colleagues about this, we're all in the same boat. We all understand this and we're rowing together. But I think ultimately this is a small percentage of the population. The money and the power is held by people who are not altruistic enough and to understand that they have the power in order to heal as opposed to the power to gather more power. It's like, yeah, okay, we get you. You made a right business choice somewhere down the line and, you're rolling in it now. What is your responsibility? To the greater good. And that's the place where I look when I don't know what to do next. I ask that question of myself. I'm not sure what to do next with my business or with my career or my life. And I would like try to answer that question is like, well, it's not about me. What can I do with my knowledge and my skill set and my passions, right, in order to make things better? And I think that's a good question for all of us to be asking. I think you doing a
I
podcast gets
agree.
this information out there. We're all kind of trying to do the right thing at asking the good questions, probing deeper, trying to unpack things, and then try to move it to action. I think that's the hard part, especially when not everyone is aligned with you to move it to action. What I
Yeah,
do then? So you have to convince, and it's hard work. It's like you talk about a political campaign to just get one candidate in there that you like. We just had the elections last night. Think about just whole zeitgeist of solar panels in every building and power walls and electrifying things and not using natural gas as we once did and trying to lower the pressure on the environment and try to find ways to sequester, remove CO2 and other greenhouse gases from our environment. We've been in a very steady state for many thousands of years, and it's really the Industrial Revolution has kind of given us a lot of luxury, a lot of comfort, certainly in the first world, but at like what expense? And so you have a new idea, you don't think about the ramifications at the end. So
right.
no, we're thoughtful people. Human beings are very thoughtful. We know how to plan. We know how to set an intention and see what's going to happen next and make things happen for ourselves. But it's sort of like then it's our attitudes of our corporations and individuals and our politicians and communities at all different levels. How do we make decisions to go forward that are at a net positive for all of us?
Right. Responsible choice.
Responsible choices. We talk about that, but man, I'll tell you, we pay a lot of lip service to like the goodness, but we don't really create enough action. And this is the frustrating thing. And I watch this and I know about albedo issues, and I know about even if we stop polluting today, all
Yeah.
factories just like we got an alternative, let's stop today. There's enough legacy greenhouse gases in our atmosphere to put us we're past 1.5 degrees now. And you'll see in the popular culture, UN says, gee, we're not going to be able to meet our 2030 or 2040 degrees. It doesn't look like we're on the pathway. Well, no kidding. We are well beyond that. We're already at 1.55 global temperature increase. As a planet, we're going to be looking at 3 degrees by 2040 if we don't take action now. And again, just slowing pollution from our transportation systems, from our manufacturing systems, everywhere else, energy systems. If we don't look to do that, we're not gonna things are gonna look way different. Let's put it that way. Things are gonna look way, way, way different, and there will be sea level rises, there will be these massive storms. We see these giant thunderstorms that cause sudden flooding in areas. We've seen, you think, oh my God, we're looking at Italy or Spain or something, and they have this massive flooding. What's going on? You don't think of those areas as flood zones, but
No, we don't.
it happens. It happens. Now it's happening because, there's so much energy in the atmosphere, so much moisture, right? The more heat you have, you get more water evaporating. H2O, water, is a greenhouse gas. So the hotter it gets, the more water will evaporate, making it hotter. So it's like it's a runaway cycle. And just take a look at our neighboring planet, Venus, and say, okay, well, they got this runaway greenhouse gas thing going on, and it's not a habitable planet. Earth we're really lucky to be on this planet. It's a beautiful place, and we need to preserve that and honor that, right?
100%.
And honor our planet. These are very basic tenets of indigenous communities that have lived in nature, forever, right? And they understand that. Yet the farther away you get from that knowledge, the more perturbed it gets, and the more, yeah. So yeah, we gotta, continue to be aware, form ourselves, listen, and don't bury your head in what's going on with the Kardashians or any of this other stuff that's going on in popular culture, because if we don't manage our planet well, which we have to now. We're at a point where we have to manage our planet very, very well. So if we don't pay attention, if all of us are not paying attention to it, then it's going to get out of hand, and it's going to be too late. And it's approaching that, midnight hour. um so much distracts us from that, and I can understand that, and it's a lot to carry in one's head and one heart, and we do have to have a balance in our lives. But if you worry about your kids and your grandkids and what kind of life they're going to have, my life is a little better than my parents. I got to go to college, I got to go to grad school. I'm fine. My parents, they were great and provided for us. I never knew, but we were solidly in that middle class thing. And, I had no idea how close to the edge we were, but I had a sense that my dad started businesses and sometimes they don't work out. And yeah, so it's a individual thing, but it's a community thing, and so people should look for organizations and look for this stuff to be taught in schools. Really, our hope is in our children and educating our children. And there's amazing young people on the planet now, and I'm really excited about the energy that I see in this industry and this movement that I see from younger people who are dedicated, and that's exciting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then advances in technology too.
Yeah, how we can, yeah, take what you're talking about, weather sensing, power walls. That's amazing. That's amazing, right? Yeah.
And speaking of technology, so we're coming up on the hour here. So as we get to kind of the closing part of the podcast, why don't you share a little bit about what technologies you use in your day-to-day business to help you do either your quotes or your client outreach or anything like that? What would you improve about it? And then are you using any kind of AI integration with what you're doing now? Kind of give me
Right.
a rundown of that.
Right. So, we're, Evergreen Carbon, we are a small business, so we're not like well funded. I don't look to get into debt to run my business. So sometimes it's on a shoestring. So kind of free utility of AI, Perplexity or Chat GPT, it kind of helps me write, helps me post. I put something in there and it explains what I'm missing, or, how I can improve a particular blog post or particular, LinkedIn post, that type of thing. That's kind of where I'm using AI. However, there
Okay.
are tools of the trade that provide data on carbon markets, and also in my industry, which is really exciting now, that I think is that the advent of AI, machine learning, combined with remote sensing via satellites and drones, we really can monitor very closely methane leaks. We can monitor forests and what are the canopies doing. We can manage and observe the integrity of nature-based carbon projects. We can do remote sensing for soil carbon and grazing solutions, right? A lot of that smell you might smell, you're driving through Lubbock, Texas, it's all from feedlots where they put all the animals in very close and they feed them, unnatural food for them in order to fatten them up. And it's a miserable life. I've been to a slaughterhouse before that was actually monitoring and managing its methane. It was great, but the stench in that place will never leave my brain. So the technologies in improving the approach to carbon projects, monitoring the success of carbon projects, doing calculations, using remote sensing and say, okay, we can see this. And you can come up with machine learning algorithms that can basically predict how much carbon is in there. And they can be trusted and they can be ground truth because you can actually go in there and sample the forest, which is what has been done. Measuring trees, at 5 feet and measuring the circumference of the tree. Coming back 5 years later, doing the same measurement, and you can see how much carbon was sequestered. What if you had instantaneous data of carbon content of your forest, hour by hour, year by year, season by season, and kind of understand that so we can learn what are the best trees, what are the best forestry techniques here, how are we preserving this land, how can we compare that to water flows and groundwater and all these other things we can talk about, how are plants responding to increased temperatures, things like that, lowers soil temperature, cover crops.
Seeing those trends one way or the other.
Yeah, so I'm excited to be looking at new research and how these really traditional carbon markets are embracing these new technologies in order to improve the integrity. There's been a great move in the last few years of higher quality, higher integrity in these carbon projects. That's always been what Evergreen Carbon does, is to vet these projects. And I would look at something and say, well, I read through all the documentation, I made a phone call or two. I don't think this is a greater project as this other project, and so so I kind of do that vetting, but it's using kind of my knowledge and my experience doing that now, with Integrity Council, the voluntary carbon market, they have come up with core carbon principles, and they are basically saying, okay, this methodology is okay, this registry is okay, this registry or this methodology, not quite there yet. They're not hitting the core carbon principles, right? So they're looking at this kind of blowback and subsequent secondary effects. But I don't think they're there with SDGs, these sustainable development goals, and basically carbon financing coming back to the community, paying the project developers, yet there's still money there to send a kid in a village to school, to instead of them, sitting on a dirt floor, purchase and build a building and buy desks and buy new computers or tablets for the kids to use in school, that type of thing. Those type of technologies are out of reach for so many people. So carbon projects have that effect. I think new technologies, I embrace them all. And I think they need to be, if they're ground truth, if they're working, it eases. Laboratory tests are expensive and time consuming and a lot of field work. If I can do that with a satellite or fly a drone over this region and then say, okay, my model really works, I'm able to gather this data remotely, put it through my process, put it through my machine learning, come up with a number, this looks great, right? And then I can go in and take a lot fewer samples and say, yeah, these samples meet what the model says, we're done here. Right? Or, if we go in there and say, gee, our samples are a lot lower than what the model says, then your model is off. So then the results of that get fed back into the model, improving the model again and again. So it's a cyclical cycle of continual improvement. So AI, the machine learning is really important for that. And I think there's other applications that are being used to identify, how do we price a certain, like I mentioned, these carbon projects have different prices for what they're doing. How do we understand that the cookstove price is a competitive price or not? Like, so, and then
No,
you
that's
have,
critical.
yeah. And so the UN is creating their own register under Paris and how that's going to go. So all these efforts are kind of side by side as well. And so using technology and say, hey, this registry and this methodology published by this registry is using AI. It's allowing machine learning to help assess the carbon sequestered or carbon captured. Let's take that data and let's use it everywhere. Let's share these techniques. And so, yeah, we're competing, but we also need to cooperate together. And that's kind of been one of these issues around sustainability, right? Is my data transparent? Is it too transparent where my competitor can look at it and figure out, reverse engineer what I'm actually doing? There's this fear out there, and we need to get over it. We really do. And so it's how we organize ourselves, our awareness, our collective consciousness, and how we tap into that and be able to do the right things and elect politicians that understand these kind of very difficult concepts, I think, to understand, because they need to understand enough to pass legislation. Right. So it's like, do you allow the lobbyists to make the legislation, or do you let science drive that legislation? And so I'm with the latter. I think, understanding, being a literate person in the sciences, I think is really helpful, and having people who are very literate understand this stuff. And I see these debates and these climate scientists, what to do about albedo and these other things. And we're getting closer, but we're like running a race. Can we figure out ways to solve issues, artificially increase the albedo, or incorporate albedo changes within our carbon projects or within other development going on the planet,
Right.
right? So if you have a tundra filled with snow and you start planting trees there, well, the albedo is going to change. Maybe you want to leave the snow there. Maybe you don't want to plant trees, So you have to, so there's a lot of information. You can't just, those are hard calculations. Those are hard analysis. It requires deep research, deep machine learning, but if we're pulling together and sharing, I think we can, avoid the worst of it. But if we continue to rest on our laurels and say, hey, I'm doing okay, it's like, that's fine. But it's like, you go to the grocery store, who built the roads to get that food to market? Who's growing that? Who's picking that fruit? Where's that coming from? I take the analogy of understanding salmon. So we understand that salmon come up river and where to spawn, and then they die and bears eat them and basically poop in the woods. So basically bringing nutrients from the deep ocean into the high forest here in the
That
Pacific
makes sense.
Northwest. You build dams, we get this cheap hydro, but at the same time, we're dealing with hatcheries and putting fish in trucks and moving them around dams, or trying to figure this all out. It's kind of and they've been breaching some dams as well because of the fisheries, and trying to figure out, well, if we don't have this reservoir here anymore, how we're going to manage growing food. And maybe you shouldn't be growing that type of food in that type of ecology at that particular moment in time. And artificially, by killing the native fish, you artificially have enough water to grow your cherries in a place that maybe shouldn't be a cherry growing area. It's kind of desert. Yeah, you're adding fertilizer, you're adding water, plenty of sunshine there, awesome stuff. But if you're, again, look at the whole systems and understand our priorities. So salmon didn't lead to orchids, right? And orchids are very precious, animals here in the Pacific Northwest. We're very blessed to have orchids right off the water from my house. It's really wonderful to see, but they eat salmon. Right. And if you decimate salmon populations with our dams, the upper forests suffer, bears suffer, trees suffer, plants suffer, all the other animals that depend on the forest, the nutrients coming up into the forest, they kind of suffer.
Yep. It's all an ecosystem.
The whole ecosystem. And so, you look at, in the season, these were building a lot of dams and creating cheap power. Awesome. But no one had the foresight at that time to understand that that's going to decimate the orchid population. You might still build that dam, but you might change the design and might do a run of the river type of thing, or figure out something else in order to manage hydro, still get power, but still preserve the character of the ecosystem system. So there's, there's has to be a lot of thoughtfulness, but any decisions we make as a community really should be well thought out, well researched, and understand the ramifications so we can plan effectively. And I think AI are some of those tools that kind of help us, like, what if, right? What if we do
Yep.
this? Then it
No,
could
I think
say,
that'd be really good. I think that'd be
yeah,
really
so
good.
I'm excited about technology. It might save our ass. It really might if we can do that. But if it's being used to say, where's the next oil deposit underground, maybe not. Maybe not the best use of it, though it's great for the petroleum engineers to have these tools, but we need to put some controls on those petroleum engineers and say you can only take out so much. And then if we can, as you have done, lower the demand for fossil fuels, then naturally things will
Reach
settle
an equilibrium.
in the right way in equilibrium. But right now, we've been out of equilibrium and we're in a crisis mode that we don't see it necessarily day to day. If you live on Jamaica, yeah, you just saw it last week. If you live here in the Pacific Northwest, we get these gentle rains and these cool weathers and beautiful trees. I don't necessarily notice it,
Right.
day to day, but I see it in my grocery store prices. I see when I'm trying to buy stuff, I see prices change. And some of that is artificial, but some of it is because our ecosystems are stressed. The combination. Yeah, it's been
No,
interesting.
that's all true. That's all true. Well, we went over a little bit on time, but I've really enjoyed the conversation. I think we got a very holistic picture of what you guys do, how you help people purchase those carbon credits, and how that all affects the environment and these different projects that are being done. So I really appreciate your time today.
Sure, it's okay if I give out my email, the
Wolf
wolf
Absolutely.
at evergreencarbon.com. Hit me up and we can talk carbon credits and carbon markets. And I'm willing to explain stuff. I don't charge for my knowledge, but if you want to make a purchase through Evergreen Carbon to find a fabulous carbon project that is effective on many levels, we'd love to help you out. And then just these types of conversations, Wes, are really important for all of us to have. This has been great for letting me vent a little bit about what's going on in my
Sure.
brain, and I really appreciate that. I appreciate your time, Wes. Thank you. Yeah, evergreencarbon.com. Easy enough to
Okay,
sign,
cool.
to find. Think trees and carbon, evergreen carbon. And I don't like carbon as a euphemism because it's CO2, it's carbon dioxide. Carbon's really important. It's in our bones and our skin. It's everywhere. Every organic molecule has carbon in it. But that's the vernacular. That's what people settle on. So I said, all right, well, I'm not going to try to say evergreen CO2 mitigation and capture. No, I say evergreen carbon. So yeah, evergreencarbon.com. Yeah, I'd love to get some feedback from your listenership. I guess is what we call podcast people who listen to podcasts, and some of them have been just amazing. And I appreciate the work that you do, Wes, for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Wolf, and enjoy the rest of your week. And I appreciate your time today and joining our show.
Excellent, Wes. Thank you so much.
Thanks.